This past week, I heard some chatter down in the parish hall, and so I was being a little nosy, and I made my way down, and I happened upon the day school's pageant rehearsal. It was all the preschoolers. I saw shepherds and angels and sheep, lots of sheep. And so I stood there and I looked down, and there is Joseph and Mary in the back of the parish hall, and they're about 3 feet high. And they proudly and confidently marched on in up to the stage. And when Mary got to the stage, she picked up the baby doll, and then there was a sound of a knock. And then here comes this 4-year-old preschooler, and she had about one line, and she knew it. And she goes, I hear this, "There is no room in the inn." It was so sweet. And Mary, you hear Mary go, "Can we stay in the stable?" And she's like, "Yes, you can." It was very adamant and sincere. I found myself laughing and seeing the joy and looking at these beautiful children taking the story very seriously as they're enacting it and getting ready for their pageant tomorrow morning. But as I made my way back to my office smiling over this precious scene that I had just witnessed, I got to thinking about the real story of Jesus' birth. And Matthew tells us today that his account of Jesus' birth is the one that really took place. And the more I think about Matthew's account of the birth announcement of Jesus, the more the part of the story becomes less cute and precious and almost downright scary. Scary? Well, the story of Joseph hearing from an angel in a dream to take Mary as his wife, he complies and does what he is commanded, and it leads them off on a difficult journey to Bethlehem where Jesus is born. We can say that the birth story has a happy ending. Jesus is wrapped in swaddling clothes and asleep in a manger. He's healthy and alive during a time where there's a high mortality rate during childbirth. Joseph's obedience leads to this positive outcome. However, a closer look at this text and looking at the historical context of these 8 verses, we see that this is not just a simple story of Joseph saying yes to the angel, but a complicated, complex, and ultimately dangerous tale of God calling 2 people to care for the most precious gift to our world, Jesus. What makes this story complicated and somewhat scary is that in the ancient world, a pregnant woman who's pregnant not by her husband would not only be subjected to extreme public and religious shaming and alienation, but could be possibly stoned to death. I use the word scary and terrifying in reference to our gospel today because Mary was living in a world where being unmarried and pregnant was terrifying and downright fatal. And it's scary for me to think that a young girl was given such a massive responsibility that carried a great risk for her well-being. That is why for the longest time, I have struggled with Joseph's contemplation over how to dismiss Mary. I've always thought that he technically wanted to abandon her. He plans to do so privately in order to avoid public disgrace, but no matter how private the dismissal, any public knowledge of Mary's pregnancy would have subjected her to fatal punishment. Matthew's gospel attempts to make a point that Joseph is a righteous man, a good guy, who wants to look out for Mary by avoiding publicity over her pregnancy. But I also think that, like any other human being, Joseph wanted to avoid the public awareness of her pregnancy for him too. As Mary's betrothed, he would soon be accountable for her, and it might have been for him a sense of fear of what the public would say about his accountability in the situation. That is why when the angel appears to Joseph and says, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife," do not be afraid. There are a lot of things suggested in that command. Do not be afraid, Joseph, of what people might say and think about you. Do not be afraid of the financial stress of having a child. Do not be afraid of traveling with a pregnant woman. Do not be afraid to take Mary on as your wife, to be your husband and companion. Do not be afraid, Joseph, to be a father. Do not be afraid of the risks that this responsibility will hold for you. Do not be afraid. Well, this time of year, the feelings of fear and being afraid and anxiety and sadness, well, they don't feel like they fit or there's room in the season for those. We celebrate joy and hope as we light the candles, but the feeling of fear and anxiety sometimes feel like they don't fit. We are kind of like the birth announcement in the Gospel of Matthew. We may be invested in the season, but deep down we have our own fears and feelings of loss that don't go away just because it's a season where we may feel like we have to be happy. These feelings actually become more real and vulnerable because there is a stark contrast between them and joy. That's why, despite wanting to see the birth story as the innocent portrayal of these preschoolers in their pageant, I find myself this year fortunate to find that the grace of this story for us is that God brought God's Son into a world riddled with its own dysfunction and turmoil, and gave him to two parents, imperfect, poor, and one of which was very afraid. God picked imperfection. God chose someone who did fear and was nervous and not sure. That is so reassuring that God still chooses and loves us and wants us to be a part of God's will for the world, despite the sadness and fear we bring. On Friday, I was on a flight to Durham, North Carolina. My best friend from seminary was getting ordained to the priesthood. And I made the early flight down, and I ended up sitting next to a young man who asked me what I do for a living and was quite surprised to hear I was a priest. He had a lot of questions. And halfway through the flight, we stopped talking, and I put my headphones on and was trying to concentrate on my sermon. And I felt a tap on my arm and took my headphones out. And I could tell that when he turned to me, he was a little teary-eyed. And he said, "Sometimes I feel like as hard as I try as a Christian to pray and read scripture, go to church, as hard as I try to be a good Christian, I just never feel good enough. I just don't think I'll ever get there." I can relate to that. You know, the harder I try at things, sometimes the worse they get. But this guy was bringing up a reality that is very real for us, a feeling of inadequacy, of being unsure if we measure up to our families, our jobs, to God. It can be very exhausting and very real. But as I sat there, I told the guy that for me, I had to think a minute, but I said, for me, being a good Christian, or being a Christian, is knowing that I'm loved, and because I'm loved by a forgiving God, I just keep trying. And trying to be good is, yes, praying, which is important, and reading scripture and going to church. But I think it is also an intentional awareness of what it means to be patient and kind and loving to those around me, but also to myself. Because God's love overcomes the fears and anxieties we have because he chooses us despite of them. Just like he chose Joseph to be the human father of the Messiah, to risk his reputation as a righteous man, to take Mary as his wife, to protect her and help her carry out God's call for them to care for God's Son. At the end of our conversation, he asked me, he's like, I have one more question for you. And I said, okay, what are your spiritual gifts? Had to think about that too. These are all great questions that we have and that he had for me. But I thought that was really important as we enter Advent and we think about each candle that we've lit of hope and peace and joy and now love. What spiritual gifts that we have that can overcome the fear and anxiety that this season and this year might have brought to us? The story of Jesus' birth may not have begun with the safest or easiest circumstances for Mary and Joseph. The risks for Mary to be pregnant and unmarried, the risks for Joseph to be associated with her along with his concerns for her well-being. I preached at my friend's ordination, and she said to the clergy yesterday, if we never risk controversy, we risk never preaching the gospel. If we never risk controversy, we risk never preaching the gospel. And I think this is true for all of us as Christians. If we never risk getting past ourselves and being patient with ourselves and kind with what we fear and what we're anxious about, we risk not experiencing the opportunity to experience God's love and God's love through others. So this week, as we gear up for Christmas and for our pageant here on Saturday, may we think about the story in a different way. May we look and think about Mary and Joseph and what they risked for God. And may us think about our spiritual gifts that will help us with our own risks. Amen.